many of you, actually, let me go with this angle. How many of you know my spiel or know who I am? Raise your hand. That hurts. All right, so then I'll give a little context and then I'll kind of go into some Q&A, hopefully. My background is that I come from a family liquor store business. So I was born in Russia. I came to the US and my dad got a job as a stock boy in a liquor store and kind of grew from there and eventually owned it. I was super entrepreneurial and then I got involved in that liquor store when I was 14 and somewhere around 16 I fell in love with wine. I was able to take over my dad's business when I was 22 and from 1998 to 2003, 4, 5 in that 6-7 year window I grew it from a $3 to a $65 million business. I did that basically on the backbone of innovating around storytelling. And back then it was just having a .com in '96 for a local liquor store, and then it evolved into, you know, search and banner and things of that nature. I eventually then started a YouTube show that kind of made me internet famous and led to a lot of opportunities, which ultimately led me to 3 years ago starting an agency with my brother AJ. Originally we were basically predicated on doing community management. 2 years ago we started creating micro content, which is what I think a lot of the conversation is now about. For me, standing up here thinking about who's in the crowd and what this conference is about is interesting because I think that what this all kind of nets out at, and everything that you've heard here today and everything I'm about to say, that information's pretty commodity. Most of you have heard it. Most of you have read it. I think what's more interesting to me is the lack of execution around it, right? So I think a lot of us understand this is happening, and I think a lot of us talk about it, but the stunning lack of execution in the marketplace and the overwhelming let's just do what we've always done has always been the thing that's been most shocking to me in the 3 years that I've been involved in corporate and working with big brands. Paul Markham, who was here earlier, is a client of ours. We do the content for them on their social networks. I think the most interesting thing is, you know, I sit here and I see Refinery 29. I remember when I saw that 3 or 4 years ago, I'm like, oh shit, these guys are starting to get it. This kind of commerce, content, all of this stuff is starting to bleed together. And I think when you sum this whole thing up, this whole day, this whole movement, this whole conversation, the first thing I would say is this. I think all of us in this room and pretty much all of us outside of this room in this world recognize that 99.9% of the ads are straight shit, mainly because they bring no value. Just like when I was kind of growing up in the last couple years around angel investing and investing in a lot of companies, the companies that I'm always looking to invest in have to solve some problem or bring some value. And I think that the biggest problem that we've had in the space for a long time is most of these things are not bringing us any value. And I think the opportunity for native ads, real-time ads, any way you want to put it is, how are we as storytellers for our brands or businesses going to find a way to bring some sort of value to the end consumer? And the funny part is, I actually think the #1 place to focus on in that is escapism, right? A lot of people here watch TV, watch movies, listen to music, watch New York Jets games, strictly to get away from the fact that our world is complicated and intense. And I think that escapism is a real huge opportunity in the world that I live in. So my company is very focused on how the hell do we storytell in a world that looks like this, right? Everybody's just like this. Everything's so fast. And I go back to thinking about this historically. So I think about the Leo Burnett company and what they did in the 50s and 60s. And I think they kind of figured it out. And I think it's why they had so much success. They understood the psychology of the consumer sitting on their couch, watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and realized that those people during that era, during that time, in a captive way, were interested in characters and stories. And so they decided during the break, when we were being intrusive, which is all we've ever done in advertising for the last 100 years up into this moment where it's now being debated, in that intrusive moment when we stopped them from doing what they naturally wanted to do, they decided to piggyback on the thesis psychologically. They gave you more characters. They gave you the Jolly Green Giant and Tony the Tiger. They gave you the Keebler Elves and the Marlboro Man. And they understood the psychology of what you were doing when you were sitting on your ass in your home, captive, and not getting up unless you were taking a piss, right? And so I think that what we need to do in this market today is do the same exact thing. Why are we captivated by meme culture? Why are we scanning through our news feeds so quickly? What value are we getting out of a quick laugh or a chuckle Or why in the world do some of the most engaged pieces of content I put out are content of like, find the little character in the background of these pictures. It's in essence, literally, things that we used to do when we were 5 and 6 in kindergarten, yet consumers like it because they're most often bored or trying to escape. And I think that what I'm most fascinated about is this. It all ends and starts with storytelling. And I think that for me, when I think about native ads, is how do I storytell in the mindset of the consumer? So great, I heard the panel before me, and it's wonderful to show a banner ad or during the time. I do think time has a lot of value, and I think that's really important. But I think that we need to start digging a little bit deeper into the psychology of why they're there in the first place. Nobody goes to a website to then look on the right side of a website, see a banner ad, and click it, right? Most people don't watch television shows for the sake of watching the commercials. All we've done collectively as an industry for 100 years is fucked people up from what they actually wanted to do. And I think that it's collectively everybody's job now, because they have so many alternatives and there's so many more opportunities for us to figure out how to add value to the overall experience, whether that makes them laugh, whether that gives them a utility. I think that there's a huge amount of that. And so for me, I'm starting to think about how do we problem solve where we're actually solving business problems around content. The two things that I'm really driven by today that continue to go in my head over and over and over again is why in the hell did Guinness, when they figured out that they had pub pours down for the first time ever, 50 years ago, go to pubs, figure out what people were talking about, and then decide to launch the Guinness Book of World Records, because they figured that because trivia was the #1 thing that people talked about in pubs, that if they could own that story and get people to talk about those things, that it would elude them to go and buy beer. Why did they go there, and what is the 2013 version of that? Why did Michelin, 100 years ago, decide to solve their business problem of people in cities not driving enough so they weren't wearing down their tires? And so why did they decide to start storytelling about the hotels and the restaurants in the suburbs and the countryside to get people to drive? And then that's why the Michelin star system today dominates outside the US the authority around where you go and eat and where you stay when you go on vacation. These are two companies a long time before us smartasses that figured out that if we could just bring some sort of value in addition and solve some sort of problem, that there's a way for us to kind of own that thought, that conversation, that psychological sector of that consumer's mind, and then benefit as a brand from that. I think that that is the challenge for all of us. It's why I've always paid attention to this company, Refinery 29, I'm pointing, here's a sign. And why the only reason I'm sitting here is quite simple. The reason I'm sitting here is, yeah, okay, I built a $60 million e-commerce wine business, but a lot of people have done that. What I did when I saw YouTube come out was I saw another platform that allowed me to storytell, and so I decided one day in 2006, 9 months after they launched, to take one of my stock boys and send him to Best Buy. He brought back a camera. I sat in front of a table, put 4 bottles of wine on it, and drank them for the next 20 minutes. And recorded it and put it out there, and realized very quickly why only 12 months later 400,000 people a day were watching it, because I did something. I brought value, and here was the value. By show of hands, and I know you're tired, how many people here are into wine or have a friend or family member that is fairly into wine? Raise your hand. Very nice, most of you. So then you will know this. The second somebody gets even a little bit of wine knowledge, they become a straight douchebag. So what I did in 2006, it's true, thank you. It's true, right? Well, why'd you order that year? Because I fucking love it, dickface. What I did in 2006 was I became the first person in that world to talk to people about wine instead of down to them. And that was the value that I brought. I made a bunch of people that drank beer or watched wrestling or crumbled when a wine list was put in front of them at a business meeting, start getting confident, and made them better wine drinkers. Just like, oh, by the way, the reason that Instagram sold for $1 billion was because they made us take better pictures. They brought value. And so I fundamentally ask the advertising world, the native world, whatever the fuck we call this, to think about At the end of the day, we completely, for the last 100 years collectively, have massively disrespected the end consumer. And we've tried to figure out ways to shove shit down their throats when they didn't want them. And the shift and the opportunity right now with the conversation that we're having is how do we start working a little bit harder and stop worrying about scale and start realizing that not all impressions are equal and start figuring out how to bring some sort of value to the end consumer so that they actually could care about the brand and the context of that brand impression actually may want them to do something, which is, oh, by the way, at the end of the day, we're here to sell shit and make them do things, and the way to do that is to care about them first. You love your parents because they loved you first. It's time for us to care about our customers first. And I think we need to figure out ways to do it. And I think that we've never had more opportunity to do it. And we have plenty of data, and we have tons of data, but this is all predicated on one thing. When is this group and this world gonna start executing around this thing that we all know works dramatically better than the 99% of the other shit that we do that is dumb and brings zero value to the end consumer? Thank you. Do I have time for some Q&A? So I'm really hoping for some Q&A because I think that just brings so much more value. So does anybody have a question? Awesome.
Hey, Gary, Mike Gaffney from ShareThrough.
Hey, Mike.
When you talk about value and data, how much of the data, we have access to an unlimited amount of data, how much of that is value? Is 100% of it valuable? Is it 10% of that data valuable?
I mean, you know what the weird thing for me is I'm stunned. You know, again, I come from like selling lemonade and baseball cards and wine. So now I come into, and I have a lot of clients that are CPG clients, and I'm just always stunned. And a lot of people here are much more tenured and understand this better than I do. I'm fairly new to the corporate world. I'm just stunned how many people forget like what they're trying to do for a living, right? Like we just get so on these tangents and it gets so inside marketing baseball, I call it, you know? We just talk about our terminology. I mean, the data is as valuable as you wanna make it as long as you actually understand what you're trying to achieve. So like the clients that are most happy with the work that I'm doing by producing micro content for social networks are the ones that are e-commerce, like Green Mountain Coffee. They know how many K-Cups they sell because of our micro content. And so I'm writing a new book called Jab, 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 Right Hook. And it talks about the formula of like setting this up because most of us in this room and in the world are in right hook, right hook, right hook, right hook mode, always pushing. So we need to find how to bring value. I think the data is super important, but I think we overuse data. And I'll tell you one thing I very much believe about data. Data's post-game. It told you what already happened. And I think we need to innovate more on our intuition and start using more EQ in this industry than just IQ. Dan just said he's giving $500 to the next person to ask a question. Awesome, man, congrats. Give it to him.
Dan, I'm waiting for that, by the way. How you doing?
What's
Craig
your name, man?
Craig Kostlik at Condé Nast. How are you?
Hey, Craig, how are you?
Quick question. So,
yeah.
What you just mentioned, it's really interesting, right? It's the idea that, you know, somebody can see the kind of the direct results that my content has. You know, Green Mountain Coffee, they can see how many cups. So for a larger purchase item, right, where think about autos, for instance, right? It's like average, like you use 8 to 10 different sources to actually buy your product, and you're only making that product purchase once every couple years. For a higher ticket item, how do you use an attribution model, right, to kind of go back to, are you actually getting lead gen? Are you actually moving vehicles?
So this is like the most interesting question for me in the whole space, especially around social and the content within it. The answer is you use the same model you use for everything else, right? It's an impression somewhere along the decision-making path, right? And so a lot of people come to me and are like, well, what's the ROI of the social media content we're producing? And then I'm always asking them, cool, like awesome. And this was a real question for me asking them because I was just getting into the industry. I'm like, well, how do you do it for outdoor media? How do you do it for your print? How are you doing it for your commercials? And the answers were straight garbage bullshit, right? I started like calling my, nerd fucking friends at MIT and they're like, this is shit math. I'm like, right? And so like, so the funny thing is I continue to try to figure out when they ask me that question, why they don't have an answer for any of the traditional shit other than fucking Nielsen's told them, it hurts, right? Like the math that I have a big television client, and they're spending so much money on outdoor media, right? And I'm like, cool. I'm like, by the way, as you're debating my scope over here for this fucking nothing money that you put in one fucking billboard in Kansas, can you explain to me what the ROI of that billboard is? And nobody's ever got an answer. There's models. There's things that our industry has accepted. your company in the print business, we've accepted 3 times circulation. When I finally learned a couple months ago what that meant was, oh, Jane might leave her fucking Vogue in a bus, and I might come up, pick it up, and go to page 147 and see the fucking Jaguar ad, right? I was like, shit, that's fucked up, right? Right, 8, respect, good brand, right? So, I mean, I think that a lot of things have been accepted in this world, and it's funny, now that I'm not in my wine shop, which is over there in New Jersey, every time I come once every 2-3 months, everything's broken. When I was in it, it all seemed right. I'd been in it my whole life. I was so successful, but it's like shit, with a new eye, it's like so many things are flawed. The things I've learned from other areas. I feel like I walk around in this world and I'm like, wow, wow, right? You come with fresh eyes. I think that there's a lot of shit that is being accepted that is not true. I mean, some dude stood at the top of that building, clicked how many cars drove by, multiplied it, and came up with a price for the billboard that's on, the site. I mean, it's ridiculous. As I told that client, and I like to say in keynotes, and some of you have seen this, when we're in New York, so a lot of you might be from the West Coast. When you're home, when you drive the next time, watch how many people out of the 5 people you drive past are on their cell phone while they're driving. At least 3 of the 5, at least. So I always tell my clients, I'm like, people aren't looking at billboards. They're not even looking at the fucking road anymore. And so I think it's every person in this room's job to care about one thing. Where are the eyes and ears of the end consumer? And the eyes and ears are shifting. That last panel, they're clearly in mobile. But very honestly, I've been obsessed with mobile for the last 3 years. It's all I think about. Most of the things I invest in, I'm trying to figure out how to storytell in it. But now, very honestly, after playing around with Google Glasses, I'm like, fuck. I'm like, all right, now this, right? And so what's gonna happen when somebody goes into a supermarket and my client's product has some bad news on it, and when they look at it, it's physically gonna be there and giving them information about the recall or why it's not healthy. I mean, we're not gonna need McDonald's to put the calories on the sign. We're gonna get it if we want it based on the apps we put on our Google Glasses, and that's 36 months away. It's gonna be here in a heartbeat. So at the end of the day, we can talk about tactics in here all we want, and we should be executing because it matters, but I think there's a philosophy shift that needs to happen overall, which is we have to start from the consumer, not from us. I think there's way too much us talk and us think, what we want, what's good for us. This will be good for us if this happens. If you reverse engineer what they want, you have a far better chance of the conversion that we're all looking for. Cool. Yeah, this guy right here. No, not even close. I thought I was trying to be good because I didn't know most of the people in here.
Hey, Gary, it's Ryan Charleston from Adpressive.
How are you?
Good.
Good, man.
There's a lot of talk about agencies and the role they play in native advertising,
Yeah.
storytelling. Obviously, that's what they're good at.
Yep.
And how publishers are kind of encroaching on that territory.
Yeah.
Doesn't this, though, put them back sort of at the center?
Who? The publisher?
Agencies.
Listen, very honestly, and I said it when I was in the wine business, I sat in front of a room like this in Napa with a hell of a lot more people, and I said, in 1999, I said, listen, I'm starting to do a lot more business on this thing called e-commerce that you all think is stupid. And I'm like, you better not make the mistake of me having more value than you. All of you in this room should start selling your wine direct to consumer. Because if you do, you're gonna keep a hell of a lot more of the money. To me, if VaynerMedia, my agency, does not bring value to my client, we should be out of business. So should everybody. So the answer is, you can't just say agency. It's like saying social network. Some suck shit and don't deserve the business. Some are good and are bringing more value, because it's really funny. That's another thing that I've learned about this agency thing since I decided to start one. I can't believe all hours are treated equal. I get on the phone with procurement and they're like, well, this, and I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, that company is shit. Like, I'm doing good work. Can't I get more value for my hour if it's quality? And so I think that's what it comes down to. I think that publishers should play, very honestly, I'll go really rogue on you on this question. So if you look at data, which I love so much, if you look at data, in 1982, the percentage of MBAs that went to CPG clients versus retail that went to Procter, and all the way up into the early 2000s, everybody went to Procter and PepsiCo and companies. Somewhere around 99, 2000, you started seeing an interesting shift where a lot of people started going to retail, and more importantly, the creme de la creme were starting to go retail. So over the last 30 years, the amount of money that brands have put into working media versus trade has been stunning. If you look at the money that retailers like Kmart and Woolworths and all those guys got from brands in 1982, it was nothing. It was an afterthought. When you start looking at the money today that the Walmarts and the Costcos and what now Amazon is asking for, the trade dollars, it's stunning. At the same time, those companies, those Walmarts and Costcos, the amount of private labels they had 30 years ago were non-existent. Today, they're substantial parts of the business. So brands are funding their competitor. Their competitor isn't, Unilever's competitor isn't necessarily Cincinnati. It's more Arkansas than they think, and soon to be Seattle, right? So here is where I'm going with this, because you don't know why the fuck I'm saying this. Somewhere around the time when the talent started going to the retailer instead of the brand, something interesting happened. I actually think that the smartest brands out there, when they start winning the creative battle, and all of a sudden the best creatives aren't going to startups and maybe aren't going to fancy schmancy agencies, but they're going to brand direct and they become the best storytellers, I think there's a major battle between the publisher, the brand, and the agency. And who's gonna win is who's ever good at it, right? And so there'll be a fleshing out. There's a lot of below average work out there at scale that's gonna be fleshed out because the innovation's on, people are paying attention. I think the number one creative chick right now that is coming out of school today may wanna go to a fancy agency here on Madison Avenue. I think in 3, 4, 5, 7 years, it's gonna be interesting where that gal might wanna go, and it may wanna be brand direct. Every person, every business, every human in here, every brand, smartwatch, everybody is in the content war now. We're all in the content business, and it's all gonna come to a head, and quality's gonna win, and whoever's got the right strategy is gonna win.
So what about the role of paid? I mean, we know like breakthrough, we've gotta have that behind it. So how do you guys approach that?
So we don't play a whole lot in paid as a company. We do a lot of social media ad buying for certain clients, especially as paid has gotten into content as a sponsored story thought process of amplifying at that moment. And if you have a paid agency, you have to call them and email them. You miss your moments. Listen, I think paid is great, but I also think that it's funny. I don't think about it a lot, to be honest with you, because it's funny to me how in this world, paid media is such a nice word and non-working media is such a bad word, right? But the way I look at it as an entrepreneur is paid is renting and non-working is owning if you do it right. And so, I understand the amplification. I think the pricing of most traditional at this point is not in line to the reality of what it's delivering. I don't think a single person here. How many people in this room, by show of hands, outside of live sports and the Oscars, when they watch their TV shows, whether it's on Netflix or DVR, the far majority of, or on demand, the far majority of the scripted television they watch? Raise your hand. Just curious. How many of you, if you're watching scripted TV, are not watching it live when it's being broadcast? Weird, all of you. How many of you, when you're then watching that, especially on DVR, are fast forwarding every single commercial? So to me, that's the interesting part, right? There's a lot of paid that's just not being consumed. Now, I will respect scale, and I know the conversation of scale, and especially I only work with Fortune 500s. It's all scale conversations at all time. But going to a 80,000 person arena, standing there and yelling your story, but nobody's in those seats, is not achieving scale. And so I think there's a major shift in the marketplace. I think that people need to be more entrepreneurial. The more I've realized of what's really happening is brand managers. This is the biggest brain fuck I got when I got into the game. That a brand manager, like one dude and one gal, are running $1 billion business. I was like, how the fuck, right? I remember my first meeting with Trident Gum. I was all excited at Cadbury. I'm like, oh man, there must be can't wait. You're gonna meet the entire team. I'm like, we get into a small room. I was confused. 2 people walked in. I'm like, you're the entire team? You sell $1 billion worth of gum? They're like, yep. I'm like, geez, and so I started thinking about they're outsourcing a lot of stuff. They don't have time, and so for them to be efficient, because they're just human beings, they're doing things that are a little easier, planned up front, and scale becomes quite valuable. I don't necessarily think scale is always right. I think scale, for example, is the way that the US used to fight their wars, big bombs, battleships. I think marketing looks a lot more now like the way we're fighting our current war, which is you gotta go to a village, you gotta find the dude, and you gotta convert his 17 people, and then you gotta go to the next one. I think, hand-to-hand combat for brands is gonna become a bigger reality, and when they start realizing that non-working dollars is a good thing, that's entrepreneurial, that's something you can own and remarket to and continue to market to and drive your impressions down over time, I think there's gonna be an interesting shift over the next decade, or not. Yeah. One more? Sure.
We talked a lot about
What's your name, man?
Jeff Allen with Zipless.
How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good, Jeff.
We talked a lot about solving the problem first, and actions that engage consumers take place after you're helping them do something. What do you think the implications are for that around a CPA or a CPE model, as opposed to you're running a page view where there's an action they could take place, and if they do, they're going to be happy and you solve a problem, but they don't need to. And the reason I bring that up is, Google's got a huge liquidity, trillions and trillions of ad avails, right? All these keywords, right? But you may not have enough to generate that on a CPA or a CPE model. So how do you think about translating an action native campaign to a non-impression based model?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question properly, because it's interesting to once you said Google, it's funny where my mind went while you were asking the question, which is the thing that I'm most passionate about is trying to understand where the market's going to be 12 to 18 months, because I feel like it's not too far out, but it's far enough that I'm still being practical, but I'm not getting too far ahead of myself. I am completely fascinated by a lot of the case studies and the work we're doing on a certain consumer, especially when you start hitting around 25 and under, about how they don't even see certain things on websites. The debate of there's an interesting study coming out of Stanford that the average 25-year-old and under doesn't even see the right side of a website, because that's where they know the things that don't bring them value. I think the way I thought about it as you were asking questions is, I think we've ruined ads the way they look. I think we have to take a pretty rogue attempt. The reason QR codes don't work in the US is the first 100,000 QR code campaigns that rolled out here were for videos of the commercial for that brand. There was no reason for anybody to do it. And once they did it once or twice, they're like, this blows. I'm never doing a QR code again. And we got into that trained action. I think that there's a bigger shift going on. I think we apply old marketing habits to the new platform. You go look at the first 100 television commercials, and they're radio ads, because that's what we did. When I look at banner ads on mobile devices, I'm like, what the? It has no value. And so I think the reason native matters so much is I do think content, the line between church and state has been so crushed. People are willing to trust you as long as you don't fuck them with it. And so they're caring less about that. I believe that ESPN and Nike are competitors right this second, and maybe don't realize it yet, or they do and they're just setting themselves up for it. I think Nike's gonna be producing content, and we'll have a Nike channel wherever that may live, whether it's on television or the web, and I think ESPN's gonna sell sneakers. And so I think, to me, when I think about that question, the mechanism to deliver those ads, I think, have been spoiled very similarly to a QR code, and I don't think they get revived. It's why I started betting heavily on social when I started understanding the data around email services. I built my business on email services. Email open rates last year dropped 12% from 34 to 22. I mean, colossal collapse. People are not opening emails anywhere close, because the one thing I know more than the sun's coming up tomorrow is this one statement: marketers ruin everything. It's what we do. We find something and we squeeze the living shit out of it until it doesn't breathe, right? And so, how many people here signed up for Living Social or Groupon or Guild Group or one of these sites? Do you remember how you felt back in the day when you first got on there? You couldn't wait to get fucking $50 worth of sushi for $25, right? You just couldn't wait. But because they ruined it, because they didn't target it well enough, because they didn't bring you any value, because they pounded you until it brought you no value, you now delete it without even looking at it. And you don't give a shit if they're offering you $1 million home for $100. You're like, delete it, spam, get the fuck out. I believe there's a far majority of the banner, the search, the keywords, the mechanisms to deliver these ads we talk about in debate. I think philosophically that's broken, so I don't think much about the next step, because to me that's broken. And so what's the next step? Social became that, but now I look at the engagement numbers and things that have happened on Twitter, 5 years later, and they're lower because it's such a fire hose. That's the brilliance of what Facebook realized they had to do to keep their product. Edge rank mattered, right? If they were going to show you everything, then you were dead. And so I think advertising's much more broken than people think. I think that that we are wasting dramatically more money than people think. I am blown away by how many people's ambition is to go to the south of France, drink some fucking pink wine, and win an award. I'm stunned.